Here's a number to start with, 79%. That's how often Reher-Shepherd won. Not races, individual rounds. Every single time two Pro Stock cars rolled up to the line and the tree dropped, over a 5-year stretch, this guy won nearly 4 out of every 5 of them. And almost nobody outside the hardcore drag racing world has ever heard his name. That's the gap we're closing today. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about how the real money and the real genius in racing almost always hides behind the people nobody bothers to put on a poster. If you're someone who loves the engineering and business stories buried underneath drag racing's greatest machines, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So here's the thing. To understand why Reher-Shepherd matters, you have to understand what Pro Stock actually was in 1980, because it's not what most people picture when they hear the words drag racing. Forget the nitromethane funny cars throwing fire and the top fuel dragsters that look like missiles with wheels. Pro Stock was the thinking man's class. It was the factory hot rod division, naturally aspirated, gasoline-burning door slammers. No fuel-burning shortcuts. No throwing a bigger, angrier motor at the problem until it went away. In Pro Stock, the engineering actually won. You had to outthink the other guy, and that's a completely different kind of war. And in the late 70s, the guy ruling that war was Bob Glidden out of Whiteland, Indiana. Methodical, relentless, somewhere between a surgeon and a machine. He'd won 3 straight NHRA championships in 1978, 79, and 80, running Fords, and nobody had cracked his code. He was the wall everybody kept running into. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so this is a story about Glidden then. It's not. Because next door to all that, and I mean that almost literally, there was a quiet guy from Arlington, Texas, running his own cylinder head shop out of an industrial park, who was quietly turning into something genuinely terrifying. His name was Reher-Shepherd. And in 1980, he came within one broken transmission of taking the title away from Glidden. Then he spent the next 4 years making absolutely sure that never happened again. Here's what most people don't realize. The thing that made Shepherd unbeatable wasn't really Shepherd at all, at least not alone. It was a 3-man partnership where every single piece fit together in a way that looks, in hindsight, almost too perfect to be real. And the story of how those 3 men found each other is honestly half the genius. Picture 2 sons of college professors. David Reher's father was an economics professor from Iowa who landed at the University of Texas at Arlington. Buddy Morrison's father was an agriculture professor who transferred to the same school. So you've got these 2 kids of academics, both completely obsessed with going fast, and in 1971 they start an engine-building business in the back room of a parts store in Mansfield, Texas. And I want you to picture their starting capital here, because it's the whole story. A toolbox, a 1/4-inch drill, and a die grinder. That's it. That's the entire operation. 2 guys, a back room, and a fistful of hand tools. Meanwhile, right next door in that same industrial park, Reher-Shepherd had opened a shop called Shepherd Racing Head. And look, the proximity was not an accident. These guys had been beating on each other for years at what Reher called the hole-in-the-wall tracks, the little Division 4 strips scattered from Arkansas to Oklahoma. Everybody in that world already knew exactly who Shepherd was, and the partnership came together the way the best ones almost always do, out of pure necessity. Reher and Morrison suddenly needed a driver, because their guy Bobby Cross had left, and Shepherd, at the same moment, had just blown up his engine and didn't have the resources to keep going solo. So 3 broke Texans pooled what little they had. And here's where it gets really interesting, because the combination turned out to be worth wildly more than the sum of its parts. Think of it like a band where every member plays a different instrument and there's 0 overlap. Reher was the analytical brain, the strategist who read problems the way his economist father probably read market structures. Morrison was the engine of momentum, the "why don't we try this" guy, the one who built the team's first dynamometer and first flow bench from scratch at a time when drag racers basically didn't own that equipment. And Shepherd was the hands and the reflexes, a man who could shape a cylinder head so precisely that engineers at major manufacturers would eventually come asking how he did it, and who drove with reflexes everybody described as something close to supernatural. Now, you don't go from a backroom parts store to beating Bob Glidden overnight. There's a building phase, and it's full of moments where this whole thing could have just quietly died. The first real signal came in 1972, when Reher-Morrison talked a nervous, underconfident Shepherd into towing his lime-green Chevy 2 Nova wagon all the way to Ohio for the NHRA Spring Nationals. And the guy who needed convincing to even make the trip went up there and won modified eliminator, meaning his car was the quickest at the entire event. Something clicked in his head after that. He came home understanding he could win at the national level. But the moment that almost ended everything came 4 years later, in 1976, and it nearly took the driver with it. Because before the championships, before the records, before the dominance, there was a crash that should have been the end of the entire story. And what they decided to do next is the real reason this happened. So in 1976, the team takes the jump into Pro Stock for real. They build a Chevrolet Monza powered by a 331 cubic inch small block and haul it to the NHRA Summer Nationals at Englishtown, New Jersey. And then a Heim joint breaks. For those who don't speak chassis, a Heim joint is one of those small pivoting connectors that ties suspension and steering pieces together. It's a part the size of your thumb, and when it let go at speed, it put Shepherd hard into the wall. The crash was bad enough that Shepherd stopped driving for a while. The team had to bring in a replacement driver, a guy named Richie Zull, just to keep the operation running. And here's where you can actually see the alternate history version of this whole story, the one where there is no Lee Shepherd legend at all. Think about the math from the team's side. They're 3 guys who started with a drill and a die grinder. They have almost no money. Their driver just got hurt in a wreck at a major national event, and the car is wadded up. That is the precise moment where most small operations quietly fold the tent, sell the trailer, and go back to their day jobs. It's not weakness. It's just arithmetic. But that's not what they did. And the decision they made instead is, I'd argue, the single most important business decision this team ever made, more important than any cylinder head, any engine, any rule they ever exploited. They sat down and decided that being a midfield team was not acceptable. If they were going to do this at all, they were going to do it seriously, all the way, no half measures. And look, that sounds like a motivational poster. But in racing, that sentence has a price tag attached, and the price is brutal. It means you reinvest everything. It means the shop money goes back into the cars instead of into your pocket. It means you commit to an arms race against teams with more resources than you have, and you bet that being smarter will beat being richer. Here's what most people don't realize about that kind of decision. It only works if you actually have an edge to compound. Throwing money you don't have at a problem just makes you broke faster. But these 3 had something specific. Reher's brain, Morrison's drive to build tooling nobody else owned, and Shepherd's hands. They weren't betting on luck. They were betting on the one thing they genuinely had more of than anybody, the ability to engineer their way out of a corner. And in 1978 that bet produced the first real weapon. They rolled out a second-generation Chevrolet Camaro Z28 with a 108-inch wheelbase. Now, that number probably means nothing to you, so let me put it in context because the wheelbase is the whole trick. Everybody else in the class was running Monzas and Vegas, short little cars. Shepherd's Camaro was dramatically longer. And a longer wheelbase does 2 things. 1, it makes the car far more stable at high speed, which matters enormously when you're trying to go straight at 160 miles an hour. And 2, and this is the genius part, under NHRA's absurdly complicated pounds per cubic inch rulebook of that era, the small block combination in that body earned favorable weight allowances. So follow the logic. Longer car equals more stability equals the driver can lean on it harder. Favorable weight break equals the car can be lighter than the competition. Put those together and you've got a combination that's theoretically unbeatable, as long as the engine is good enough. And the engine was getting very, very good. At their Division 4 debut at La Place Dragway in Louisiana, Shepherd set a 162 mph speed record. And the week before, in testing at San Antonio, he'd clocked an 8.75 elapsed time. That's when people across the sport started actually paying attention. The red, white, and blue Camaro became an icon almost immediately. And in 1979 and 1980, Shepherd started doing the thing that separates good drivers from frightening ones. He started beating Bob Glidden. At the 1980 Gator Nationals, both cars ran identical 8.51 elapsed times. Identical. To the hundredth of a second. So who won? Shepherd. On the whole shot. Which means he won on reaction time alone. The human reflex, the few thousandths of a second between the light turning green and his foot moving. The cars were dead even and the driver was the deciding factor. People in the stands were rubbing their eyes. Then at the U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis, he beat Glidden again. And going into the season finale, the World Finals at Ontario, Shepherd had the fastest car in the entire class, a qualifying run of 8.43 at 159.57 miles an hour that nobody else could come anywhere near. He had the championship in his hands. You can practically see it. And then, in the second round of eliminations at that final event, the transmission broke. Just like the Heim joint 4 years earlier. One small mechanical part, the entire season hanging on it, and it let go at exactly the wrong moment. Glidden went on to win the race, which also earned him the bonus points for low elapsed time and top speed. And when all the math was finally done, Glidden had the 1980 championship, and Shepherd didn't. By the slimmest of margins, beaten not by a faster car but by a broken gearbox. Dave Dinsmore, the team's publicist at the time, said they were pretty devastated. But he said something else too, that it served as fuel for their commitment in the years ahead. And you can tell from what happened next that he was exactly right. Because losing that title didn't break them. It armed them. And what they came back with in 1981 was, frankly, kind of brilliant. So 1981. They come back, and what they show up with is one of those moves that's so clever it almost feels like cheating, except it's completely legal, which is the whole point. They build what got described as a small displacement big block Chevy. And I know that sounds like an oxymoron, like a jumbo shrimp or a slow Ferrari. So let me explain what they actually did, because it's a masterclass in reading the fine print. A big block and a small block aren't just different sizes, they're different architectures. The big block has bigger, better breathing port designs, more airflow capacity baked into the casting. But it's also, well, big, which usually means heavy, which usually means it lands in a worse weight class under the rules. So what Reher and the team did was take that superior big block architecture and de-stroke it. Shorten the engine stroke to shrink the actual cubic inches down small enough that it qualified for the small block weight allowance. So you get the breathing advantages of a big block while paying the weight penalty of a small block. You're getting first-class legroom at an economy ticket price. And here's what most people don't realize. That move doesn't come from a machinist. Comes from a guy who actually sat down and read the rulebook like it was a contract with money on the line. That's the Reher contribution in a single example. The rules aren't just constraints to him. They're a puzzle with exploitable gaps, and he found one nobody else had thought to look for. It worked. Shepherd won 6 NHRA national events in 1981 and took his first Winston Pro Stock championship. The thing he came one broken transmission short of in 1980, he just took. And in the process, he and Glidden started having these famous staging battles at the Christmas tree that are honestly some of my favorite stuff in this whole story, because they're pure psychology. Here's the deal. At the starting line, you stage your car. You roll forward until you trip a light beam that tells the system you're ready. But the moment you're staged, you're on the clock. The timing system is now waiting on you. And whoever stages second controls the rhythm of the whole launch. So Shepherd would simply refuse to stage first. He'd sit there. And Glidden would sit there. Two of the best drivers on Earth, engines screaming, neither one willing to blink, turning the starting line into a staring contest. In an era before all the deep staging rules got tightened up, those little mind games at the tree genuinely mattered, and Shepherd was apparently a master at them. Look, when you're that evenly matched on equipment, the war moves into the 6 inches between the driver's ears. And that was Shepherd's home turf. Now here's where everything changes, and not because of anything the team did. Going into 1982, the NHRA made a decision that blew up the entire class. They scrapped the whole pounds per cubic inch weight brake system, the exact system Reher had been so brilliantly exploiting. And honestly, you can see why they killed it. That system was creating controversy at basically every single event. The weight brakes changed constantly, nobody could ever agree on whether the rules were fair, and the whole thing had become an accounting nightmare disguised as a sport. So they nuked it and replaced it with one clean, universal standard. 500 cubic inches maximum. 2,350 pounds minimum. 105-inch wheelbase maximum. Same numbers for everybody. No more exceptions, no more calculations, no more arguing. Just build it and run it. And you might be thinking, wait, didn't that just erase Reher's entire advantage? The weight brake game he'd mastered was gone overnight. And on paper, yeah. But here's the part that matters. Why did NHRA do this? It wasn't really about fairness. It was about a competitor. NHRA, the other major sanctioning body, had this Mountain Motor Pro Stock class where teams ran enormous big block engines and were posting 7-second elapsed times. And critically, that was showing up on ESPN. So you had NHRA's monster motors running 7s on national television, while NHRA's small block Pro Stock cars looked slow by comparison. The people running NHRA understood they had a brand problem, and they had to do something dramatic to keep up. So for Reher-Morrison, this so-called disaster was actually a gift. Because while everybody else was scrambling to figure out big block power, this team had quietly been developing exactly that program in the background. The rule change didn't erase their advantage. It gave their hidden advantage a stage to perform on. And they made the point about as emphatically as it can be made. At the very first NHRA event under the new 500-inch rules, the 1982 Winter Nationals at Pomona, on the very first qualifying session, Lee Shepherd ran a 7.86 elapsed time. And just like that, he became the first driver in NHRA history to run a 7-second Pro Stock pass. The whole class had just been handed a new rulebook, and within one session, Shepherd had already redrawn the map. Everybody watching understood the game had changed completely. Now, full credit where it's due, Frank Iaconio actually went quicker later that same event, ran a 7.82, and won the race. So Shepherd didn't take the trophy home. But he took the historic moment. And more importantly, the team had just demonstrated something far more valuable than a single win. They'd shown they understood where this new rule set was headed better than essentially anybody else in the class. And the reason they understood it came down to a secret hidden inside their cylinder heads. A secret so well hidden that even the competitors holding the parts in their hands couldn't figure out what they were looking at. Okay, so the cylinder head story. This is the part that explains everything else, and it's genuinely one of the wildest pieces of engineering improvisation in drag racing history. Stay with me because it's worth it. When NHRA went to 500 cubic inches, every team suddenly needed cylinder heads that could flow enough air to make competitive power. A cylinder head, if you're not deep in this, it's the part that sits on top of the engine and controls how air and fuel get in and exhaust gets out. And the amount of air it can move, what we call flow, is basically the ceiling on how much power the engine can make. More flow, more power. Simple as that. So here's what Reher and his machinist, W.O. Simpson, figured out that nobody else was doing. They got their hands on solid GM cylinder head castings that had originally been made for alcohol racing engines. And the key word there is solid. These castings had no water jacket passages cast into them at all. Normally, a cylinder head has all these cooling passages molded right into the aluminum, channels for coolant to flow through, and those passages are fixed. They're in the way. You have to design your ports around wherever the factory put the cooling. But these alcohol castings? Essentially solid blocks of aluminum. No precast passages. And that meant Shepherd, who was the team's head porter, the guy doing the shaping by hand, had complete, total freedom to reshape the ports and combustion chambers however he wanted. No cooling passages dictating where he could and couldn't cut. It's the difference between sculpting a block of clay versus carving around a bunch of pipes somebody already ran through it. He had the whole canvas. So here's what they actually did, and it's almost unhinged in its ambition. They drilled the cooling passages by hand into the solid castings, placing them exactly where they wanted after the porting was done, instead of being stuck with the factory layout. Then they cut the entire exhaust side off the head and sealed it back up with bolt-on aluminum faceplate. And then Shepherd spent hundreds of hours, with a die grinder and aluminum filler rod, reshaping port walls and bowls and chambers, adding material here, removing it there, until the airflow numbers were somewhere the competition simply could not reach. And here's the genuinely clever part, the part that makes this a great story instead of just a good one. Competitors who got a look at these heads assumed Reher-Morrison had just raised the exhaust ports, a known, common modification at the time. That's what it looked like from the outside. But the actual extent of what had been done, the solid castings, the hand-drilled cooling, the total reshaping, was completely invisible. You could be holding one of these heads in your hands and have no idea what made it work. The secret was hiding in plain sight, inside the metal. And on top of those heads they built an engine. A 500 cubic inch monster running a 15.5:1 compression ratio on VP Racing's C14 gasoline, with a fabricated sheet metal tunnel ram intake and dual 4-barrel carburetors. And it produced something like 1,042 horsepower at 8,500 revolutions per minute. Now, you might be thinking, sure, every old racer's engine made 1,000 horsepower, that's just the kind of number guys throw around in the pits. Fair. But here's the thing. Years later, the team actually dyno-tested a period-correct rebuild of this exact combination, and the number held up. It matched the performance they'd been running against what other teams were achieving at the time. So this isn't a fish story. This is a verified figure. And Shepherd was shifting that engine at 8,500 to 8,800 revolutions per minute by feel. Not by watching a tachometer. By feel. He'd learned the sound and the vibration of the thing so precisely that he could nail the shift point in the middle of a launch without ever glancing down. And from that same seat, he was posting reaction times that consistently put him ahead of guys who got more nervous than Shepherd apparently ever did. That's the combination. The best heads in the class bolted to one of the calmest, most precise drivers anyone had ever seen. By the end of 1982, he held the Pro Stock elapsed time record at 7.655 seconds and had his second consecutive championship. Then 1983 is where it goes from dominance to something almost absurd. The team moves to a third-generation Camaro body, and now they're racing in NHRA at the same time as NHRA. And for NHRA, which allowed bigger cubic inches, they took those same radical heads and bolted them onto 615 and 632 cubic inch engines. And Lee Shepherd became the first driver in history to simultaneously hold both the NHRA and NHRA Pro Stock championships in the same season. Both of them. At once. Nobody had ever done that. And then they did it again in 1984. And I want to give you the NHRA numbers across those two seasons, because they're hard to even believe. Their round record was 48 wins and 6 losses, across 13 final round appearances in 13 events. Read that again. They entered 13 events and made the final round in all 13 of them. That's not a hot streak. That's a foreclosure. CarCraft named him Pro Stock Driver of the Year for the 4th straight season. Super Stock magazine called him the real world champion. He got voted to the All-American team by the racing writers and broadcasters for the 3rd time. The man was, by every measure that existed, the best in the sport. And the raw NHRA numbers behind all of it are even more staggering when you actually lay them out. So let's actually lay out the numbers, because they're the whole argument. The NHRA's own records show that from 1980 through 1984, Lee Shepherd reached 44 of 56 national event finals. He won 26 of them. And his overall round record across that span was 173 wins against 47 losses. Let me translate what that 173 to 47 actually means, because it's easy to let numbers like that just slide past you. It means Shepherd won roughly 79% of every individual round of elimination he entered over a 5-year stretch, and he won just about half of every national event he showed up to. Now, here's the thing about elimination racing. It's single knockout. You lose one round, you're done, you go home. There's no losing a game and winning the series. One mistake, one mechanical failure, one driver who's 1,000th of a second quicker, and your weekend is over. To win 79% of rounds in a format that punishing against the best drivers in the discipline 4-5 straight years, that is one of the most dominant runs of performance metrics in the entire history of pro stock. It's not close to normal. It's barely even comprehensible. And here's where it gets really interesting, because Shepherd wasn't dominating a weak field. He was dominating the strongest field the class had ever assembled. During this exact period, something was happening that people started calling pro stock's Gang of Four. Shepherd, Glidden, Warren Johnson, and Frank Iaconio. And the statistic attached to those 4 names is one of the most extraordinary numbers in motorsport. From 1980 through 1985, those 4 drivers won every single NHRA Pro Stock national event. 64 consecutive events, over 6 seasons, and nobody else got a win. Not one. 64 races in a row, and the trophy went home with one of 4 men every single time. Now sit with that for a second, because it tells you 2 things at once. First, it tells you how good these 4 were. But second, and this is the part most people skip past, it tells you how enormous the equipment gap had become. For 6 years, running a pro stock race was essentially a private competition between 4 operations, and everybody else in the field was racing for the satisfaction of just making the show. The other entries weren't really competing for wins. They were competing for the right to be in the photo. And within that gang of 4, Shepherd was the one who won 4 consecutive championships. Warren Johnson, a man who would go on to win 6 titles of his own and who absolutely did not hand out compliments for free, said of Shepherd, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Lee was an excellent driver who seemed completely relaxed behind the wheel, and that the relaxation was a sign he was having fun. Think about who that's coming from. That's a ruthless, serious competitor describing the guy who kept beating him, and there's no qualification in it. No, but just respect. Now, here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough, because it changes how you read everything that comes next. In the second half of 1984, the dominance started to crack. Glidden got a new Ford Thunderbird body mid-season, and by the back half of the year, it was the fastest car in pro stock. Faster than the Reher-Morrison Camaro. And Shepherd still won his 4th consecutive championship that year, but the margin was narrower, and the NHRA's own retrospective admits that the satisfaction of that 4th title was tempered, because for the first time in years, they no longer had the quickest car in the country. And if you want to understand the 5-second window where this entire story turns, that's the setup you have to hold in your head. Shepherd is a 4-time defending champion. He is also, for the first time, chasing. He's behind on horsepower relative to Glidden's Thunderbird, and the whole team knows it. So look at where they are heading into 1985. They are not a struggling little backroom operation anymore. They've picked up sponsorship backing from Hendrick Motorsports, Rick Hendrick's NASCAR operation. And that detail matters more than it might seem, because it tells you exactly how serious this program had become. This is the moment when NASCAR money was just starting to flow into drag racing, and one of the biggest names in stock car racing looked at this team of former backroom hot rodders and decided they were worth betting on. The drill and die grinder guys from Mansfield, Texas, now had a Hendrick relationship. That's the arc. That's the whole climb in one sponsorship line. And the problem they're trying to solve is pure engineering. They're behind on power and they need to catch the Thunderbird. So they open the season at the Winter Nationals, and Shepherd loses to Butch Leal in the quarterfinals. Not a disaster, but not the start of a championship defense you'd want either. And the team decides they need to test. They need track time to chase down the horsepower deficit before the Gator Nationals at Gainesville. So they go to Ardmore Raceway in Ardmore, Oklahoma. And here's the thing about Ardmore, it's not some exotic facility. It's a converted airport drag strip. It had been the team's regular test track for years, because it was close enough to Arlington to make practical sense. You load up, you drive up, you make passes, you load up, you go home. Routine. The most ordinary thing in the world for this team. On Monday, March 11, 1985, they're out there doing exactly that. Test passes, getting ready for Gainesville. Reher and Morrison are standing at the starting line, watching. There are no grandstands full of fans, no television cameras, no competitors. Just the team and a handful of crew guys on an empty strip in the middle of Oklahoma on a Monday afternoon. And Shepherd makes a full pass in the Alston chassis Camaro and records a 7.87. And then the parachute came out into a crosswind. After the run, the parachute deployed in a severe crosswind. The front end got light. Then it lifted. And then the whole car went airborne, and it rolled and flipped, and when it finally stopped, Lee Shepherd was not in it. He'd been thrown more than 160 feet from the wreckage. The cage that had been built to save him was essentially the only thing left intact. He was transported to a hospital in Ardmore and pronounced dead. He was 40 years old. NHRA South Central Region Director Dale Ham was there, and he told UPI immediately afterward that what killed Shepherd was the seat belts and shoulder harness coming undone, that Lee had been thrown out of the car. And Ardmore Police Detective Butch Kinslow said that had the harness not broken, he probably would have lived, and that the only thing still intact was the driver's cage, which held up well. Now, here's where I have to address something directly, because rumors have circulated in drag racing circles for decades about this specific crash. The whispers were that Shepherd wasn't wearing his belts, that the team had been doing short test shots earlier in the day, and that the harness being undone was somehow his own negligence. And look, I think it matters to set the record straight. In 2010, Shepherd's widow, Marcia, posted publicly to address this head-on. She said his seatbelts were on and tight, his helmet was on, his fire jacket was on. She said stories had spread that those weren't done, but they were. And she attributed the failure to the chassis builder having installed seat belts made from substandard materials that broke under the force of the crash. Now, in fairness, the contemporaneous wire reports and police statements confirmed the harness failed, but they didn't specify whether the belts were fastened properly before the crash. So there's a factual gap that can't be fully closed from public sources. But the weight of the most direct first-hand account, from the person with the most access to the truth, points clearly toward equipment failure, not pilot error. And that distinction matters, both factually and in terms of how this man's story deserves to be told. And here's what came out of it. The 2-inch shoulder harnesses of that era were subsequently replaced by wider 3-inch standards as the industry moved toward better equipment. And the chain of events after Shepherd's death drove real change. Because after Lee died, Bob Glidden had a funny car-style roll cage installed in his Pro Stock car, which was not standard practice at the time. And when Glidden had his famous 1986 crash at Atlanta, where his Thunderbird barrel rolled 6 times, he walked away unhurt. He specifically credited that cage with saving his life. And NHRA subsequently mandated funny car-style cages for all Pro Stock cars. That mandate is part of Lee Shepherd's legacy, even though his name rarely gets attached to it. The community's response was profound. At the 1985 Gator Nationals, the first event after the crash, all 16 Pro Stock qualifiers lined up in a missing man formation, the pole position left empty for Shepherd. And Glidden, who'd earned the #1 qualifying spot, voluntarily gave it up so that space could stay open. Permanent numbers on race cars across the sport got black slashes painted through them. Glidden later said that when he got the call, he and his wife pulled off the road and just sat there for a while. This is the biggest rival Shepherd ever had. And the respect isn't complicated. It's just genuine. And here's the part that outlasted everything. In 1984, Chevrolet had invited Reher to the foundry in Akron, Ohio, where big block aluminum heads were cast, and Reher personally filed the casting cores to relocate port walls and deepen valve bowls. The design that came out of that collaboration became the production Chevrolet Bowtie Big Block Head, one of the most widely used performance cylinder heads in racing history, still available today. So the secret they'd guarded so fiercely in that Arlington industrial park became the industry standard. The thing they hid became the thing everybody uses. So why don't you know his name? 3 reasons. First, television. NHRA wasn't on ESPN during his championship years, and regular season NHRA in the early 80s was something you saw in person or read about in a magazine. There's no YouTube archive of Shepherd, because that infrastructure didn't exist. Second, he was intensely private. His own publicist rated him a 10 out of 10 as a driver and a 0 as an interview. He had no interest in building a persona, only in racing and the technical work. And third, the story after 1985 got swallowed by Glidden's 5 straight titles and then Warren Johnson's dynasty, and the what might have been with Shepherd got folded into a bigger narrative instead of told on its own terms. NHRA does rank him 12th on its all-time top 50 drivers list, 3rd among Pro Stock drivers. Rick Hendrick acquired the original 1981 championship Camaro for his personal collection. But there's no Lee Shepherd Award, no name trophy, no major memorial at a national track. For a 4-time consecutive champion, that absence is loud. So here's what he left. 4 championship, 173 round wins, 26 national event victories, the first 7-second pass in NHRA Pro Stock history, the heads that became the bowtie, a safety legacy he never got credit for, and an engine company in Arlington that David Reher still runs 4 decades later. You leave a space empty because something was supposed to be there and now it isn't, and everyone understands what the space means. If you didn't know his name when this started, you should know it now. Because the numbers demand it.